This is Christopher John Bjerknes. It is May 30th, 2023. I have completed a theory I've been working on for decades now. The authors of the Torah and the rest of the Old Testament operated under the premise that the Egyptians had rejected their chief god Seth, who was the god of chaos and darkness. That God supposedly then chose the Israelites to replace the Egyptian people as his God. And if they did that, if they obeyed his laws, helped him to destroy the other gods of Egypt who had taken his place, that they could then take the place of the Egyptians, and they would inherit the Egyptian kingdom, which stretched from the Niles to Euphrates. They defined the borders by the Egyptian kingdom of Ramses II. All of this is symbolized by Moses replacing Ramses, by the firstborn of the Egyptians being killed off, and the firstborn of Israel replacing them. They adopted the reality that the Egyptians had upper Egyptian kingdom and a lower Egyptian kingdom, which they converted into the northern and southern mythical tribes of Israel. They adopted the Egyptian belief that the Pharaoh was the king of the world, the intermediary of the gods, and was a demigod and a semi-divine being, and they took that over as their twin messiahs, Messiah son of David and Messiah son of Joseph. And they adopted the history, which was current under Manetho and other Egyptian priests and Egyptian historians, that the Hyksos had conquered the Egyptian kingdom and had worshipped this god, Seth, the god of darkness and chaos. And they created the mythology that they themselves were descended from the Hyksos and would likewise take over the Egyptian empire, not through bloodshed per se, but through deception. And this became the mythology of Esau and Jacob, in which Esau represents the Egyptians, the firstborn, and Jacob represents the secondborn, the Hyksos, and the Israelites, who seized control of the Egyptian empire and the throne of the Pharaoh through deception, through worshiping the god Seth, who then chose him as their people and who demanded absolute obedience to his laws and to his quest to destroy the other Egyptian gods of the Egyptian Pantheon. Before I dive into all this, I want to thank everyone who has contributed and made this video possible. It would not have happened without your help. And I'm really deeply, deeply grateful to you for enabling me to complete this theory, which completely changes all the historical perception of how the Torah came about and how the Israelites chose themselves as the people of this god Seth and of his sole inheritance, and why it is that they want to take over this land of Greater Israel and rule the world from that kingdom. And those of you who would like to contribute, you can do so. There will be links in the description below. You can also visit my website, cjbbooks.com. Beneath each book title, there are links where you can contribute so that I can make more of these videos and keep digging deeper and deeper into this incredibly important research. Genesis chapter 15, verse 18 says, In the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. Abraham had traveled to Egypt, remember that, saying, unto thy seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt, meaning the Nile, unto the great river, the river Euphrates. That describes exactly the kingdom of Egypt at its greatest extent under Ramses II. Ramses II is portrayed as being replaced by Moses when Moses crosses over into the land of Canaan, which is what Seti I did, who worshipped Seth, and his son Ramses II did, who also worshipped Seth and who had red hair like Seth. And Ramses II utilized 600,000 foot soldiers, remember that? That's significant, to take over this vast territory, which the Kahanists and the greater Israel movement wants to take over based upon this covenant that they created, this contract between the god Seth and the Israelites. Exodus chapter 12, verse 37 states, the Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkot. They were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Ramesses, they are creating this mythology that they were replacing with Moses. They were replacing Ramses II. They were becoming the children of the Egyptian god Seth, and that they would replace the Egyptians as heirs to this great Egyptian empire, that their king would then become the Pharaoh, the messianic figure who would rule the world and be the intermediary between humanity and the gods, and that these 600,000 foot soldiers who would conquer this area represented the 600,000 souls that were in Adam that became the Israelite people, who became the heirs to Seth's world, which Seth, the god of chaos and darkness, created, and created solely for the purpose of his chosen people, the Israelites, who were the second-born, who would replace the firstborn Egyptians through deception. Diodorus recorded the history of Ramses, and I'll explain how this history was then refabricated as if it were the history of the Israelites, when the Israelites made this contract with the Egyptian god Seth to replace the firstborn Egyptians as his people, who obeyed him, worshipped him, and destroyed the other Egyptian gods who had usurped his throne. His throne was restored when the Hyksos traveled from Canaan into Egypt and took over the Egyptian empire. And his throne was also restored by Ramses II, who, like his father Seti, had taken these lands of Canaan and restored Seth as one of the chief gods of the Egyptian Pantheon. And when he ascended the throne upon the death of his father, being filled with confidence by reason of his earlier exploits, he undertook to conquer the inhabited earth. There are those who say that he was urged to acquire empire over the whole world by his own daughter, Athyrtis, who, according to some, was far more intelligent than any of her day, and showed her father that the campaign would be an easy one, while according to others she had the gift of prophecy, and knew beforehand, by means of both sacrifices and the practice of sleeping in temples, as well as from the signs which appear in the heavens, that what would take place in the future. So this is the messianic figure who would conquer the inhabited earth, much like Messiah, son of David. Some have also written that at the birth of Sethian, his father had thought that Hephaestus had appeared to him in a dream and told him that the son who had been born would rule over the whole civilized world, and that for this reason, therefore, his father collected the children of the same age as his son and granted them a royal training, thus preparing them beforehand for an attack upon the whole world, and that his son, upon attaining manhood, trusting in the prediction of the god, was led to undertake this campaign. In preparation for this undertaking, the first of all confirmed the goodwill of all the Egyptians. Remember that. That's important because that becomes part of the mythology of the Israelites obtaining the goodwill of the Egyptians, seizing all their gold, silver, jewels, and clothing to help them to go out and conquer the world. Confirmed the goodwill of all the Egyptians toward himself, feeling it to be necessary, if he were to bring his plan to a successful end, that his soldiers on the campaign should be ready to die for their leaders, and that those left behind in their native lands should not rise in revolt. He therefore showed kindnesses to everyone by all means at his disposal, winning over some by presents of money, others by gifts of land, and others by remission of penalties. And the entire people he attached to himself by his friendly intercourse and kindly ways. For he set free, unharmed, everyone who was held for some crime against the king, and canceled all the obligations of those who were in prison for debt, there being a great multitude in the goals. Remember the Jubilee and the cancellation of debts. And dividing the entire land into 36 parts, which the Egyptians call nomes, he set over each a nomarch, who should superintend the collection of the royal revenues and administer all the affairs of his division. In the mythology of Joseph usurps the throne in this way by running the Egyptians into debt and then forcing them to sell themselves into slavery in exchange for the food that they themselves had produced. He then chose out the strongest of the men and formed an army worthy of the greatness of his undertaking, for he enlisted 600,000 foot soldiers, 24,000 cavalry, and 27,000 war chariots. 600,000 foot soldiers. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses, the name of Ramses II, to Sukkot. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. That is the army of Ramses. And the Israelites are pretending that they were that army. In command of the several divisions of his troops, he set his companions, who were by this time inured to warfare, had striven after the reputation for valor from their youth, and cherished with a brotherly love both their king and one another, the number of them being over 1,700. And upon all these commanders he bestowed allotments of the best land in Egypt, in order that, enjoying sufficient income and lacking nothing, they might sedulously practice the art of war. Remember I said to pay attention to the idea that he first of all confirmed the goodwill of all the Egyptians towards himself? That's what happened with Moses in the mythology of the Exodus. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed towards this people this people being the Israelites, so that when you leave, you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters, and so will plunder the Egyptians. The Israelites did as Moses instructed, and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. In other words, they stole all of the Egyptians' gold, silver, and clothing, and thereby ruined the Egyptians and took their place. They then cast the golden calf out of the gold that they had stolen from the Egyptians, which symbolizes the theft of the Egyptian gods and the replacement on the Pantheon of Seth back onto his throne as the chief god of Israel and of Egypt. This replacement in the land of Canaan and throughout the Egyptian empire was described many times in the Torah and Old Testament. Deuteronomy states, "And it shall be, when the Lord thy God shall have brought thee into the land which he sware unto thy fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give thee great and goodly cities, which thou buildest not, and houses full of all good things, which thou filledst not, and wells digged, which thou diggest not, vineyards and olive trees, which thou plantest not, when thou shalt have eaten and be full." That's what Seti did when he took over Canaan, and that's what Ramses II did when he took over all of what is now described as Greater Israel. Isaiah, "And they shall build the old wastes, they shall raise up the former desolations, and they shall repair the waste cities, the desolations of many generations. And strangers shall stand and feed your flocks, and the sons of the alien shall be your plowmen and your vine dressers, but ye shall be named the priests of the Lord. Men shall call you the ministers of our God. Ye shall eat the riches of the Gentiles, and in their glory shall ye boast yourselves." The Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II had red hair like the Egyptian god Seth, the god of darkness and chaos. He honored Seth and took on his name as Seth, and his father, Seti I, also honored Seth and demonstrated his worship of Seth by being named after Seth. Moses is the Israelite replacement of Ramses II, and symbolizes the replacement of the Israelites as the chosen people of Seth, who would rule the Egyptian kingdom and from it the world. He bears the demonic horns, which also represent the donkey ears of Seth. Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. "For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." That Lord is the Egyptian god Seth. He slaughtered 600,000 Egyptians, according to the sages of Israel. And he then gave birth to 600,000 Israelites who would replace them. And that is the mythology which developed in Judaism. Judaism also created the mythology of Esau, representing those firstborn Egyptians who were mass slaughtered by Seth and then replaced by Jacob This appears in the Torah through the process of deception. Jacob deceives his father Isaac. Isaac is blind, as Ramses II was when he attained old age. Ramses had to pass along his kingdom, his vast empire, to his heirs, his sons, and one of those sons took the place of the other, and this becomes symbolic of the notion that the Israelites would replace the Egyptians who had rejected their god Seth, and that they would become the chosen of that god Seth, inherit the Egyptian empire in the form of Greater Israel, and then rule the world from that empire and set about to exterminate the Gentiles who came to represent the Egyptians across the world as the firstborn. Genesis states, "And Jacob said unto his father, I am Esau, thy firstborn. I have done according as thou badest me. Arise, I pray thee, sit and eat of my venison, that thy son may bless thee. And Isaac said unto his son, How is it that thou hast found it so quickly, my son? And he said, Because the Lord thy God brought it to me. That God is Seth, and Jacob is the Israelites pretending to be Esau in order to inherit the kingdom and the blessings of the god Seth that were due to the firstborn Egyptians. But since they had rejected the law and the worship of Seth, Seth was going to punish them by replacing them with the Israelites in the form of Jacob, who would inherit their birthright blessings and soul. How is it that thou hast found it so quickly, my son? And he said, Because the Lord thy God Seth brought it to me. And Isaac said unto Jacob," Isaac here is playing the role of Ramses II, just as Moses had played that role. "And Isaac said unto Jacob, Come near, I pray thee, that I may feel thee, my son, whether thou be my very son Esau or not. And Jacob went near unto Isaac, his father, and he felt him, and said, The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And he discerned him not, because his hands were hairy as his brother's hands. So he blessed them." In other words, he passed along the Egyptian throne from the Egyptians to the Israelites, and this was done by deception. And that becomes significant because the Hyksos had likewise taken over the throne of Egypt, not through wars and battles, but by usurping the throne through bribery and trickery, in the same way that Jacob was said to have done to Esau. And the authors of the Torah and the mythology of Judaism were aware of this portrayal of the history of the Hyksos that the Egyptians gave, and they wanted to play that role. And proof of that is found in the account that Josephus gives of Manetho, the Egyptian historian, and what he had to say about the history of the Hyksos according to Josephus. We have this second hand from Josephus. Josephus was a renowned forger. His works were later amended and changed by others. Josephus fabricated many events in history which did not take place. But none of that is as important to my theory as the fact that Josephus wanted to represent it in this way and wanted to portray the Israelites as heirs to the Hyksos and as the Hyksos people who had usurped the throne of the Egyptians and who had worshipped the cacodemon Seth, who then became the god of Israel. Josephus wrote in his work against Apion. Apion was an Egyptian who had criticized the Jews, said that they had no ancient history, said that they slaughtered a Greek in a human sacrifice, that they worshiped the head of an ass, etc., and revealed the fact that the Egyptians, the Romans, and the Greeks all understood that the Israelites had fabricated their history, that they were pretending to be the Egyptians, that they pretended that the god Seth was their god instead of a god of the Egyptians, and that they were imposters, pretending, having a fabricated history and pretending to be Egyptians, that their god Seth was an ass, which is why they called him Yahweh, which was the sound that an ass made when it brayed, etc., etc. So Josephus is attempting to refute all that by quoting the Egyptian historians themselves and by portraying the Israelites as if they were the Hyksos who had taken over the Egyptian kingdom. The Septuagint had earlier done the same thing, but it portrayed the Israelites as if they were victims of the Egyptians after first portraying them as the Hyksos through Joseph, who had usurped the throne of Egypt and taken the place of the Pharaoh. They then said that the Egyptians had enslaved them, that the Israelites had constructed the pyramids and then had been freed from bondage by Moses and allowed to enter and eventually, through Joshua, conquer the lands of Canaan. This is all a convoluted process by which the Jews of Alexandria were trying to conceal the fact that their goal was to make Seth the god of the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon, destroy the other gods, and for the Israelites to replace the Egyptians within the Egyptian kingdom and then rule the world. They wanted to conceal that plan because they knew that the Greeks and the Romans would oppose that plan for obvious reasons, since that's essentially what the Greeks and Romans had done and greatly expanded upon the Egyptian kingdom. So instead of letting the others know, letting the others be in on this plan, they instead created this written, fabricated history of the Torah and the Old Testament. But they interpreted that through an oral tradition. And in their oral tradition, they revealed the fact that, in fact, their chief god is Seth, this god of darkness and chaos. And that eventually, at the end of the 6 days of creation, they will reveal the fact that they do indeed worship this evil, demonic god of darkness, and they will destroy all the gods of daylight, and they will destroy all the people who worship the gods of daylight, and they will then become the lot and sole inheritance of Seth, and they will rule what they call shining darkness, which is the realm of Seth, which Seth imposed as one of the plagues on the Egyptians. And Seth also slaughtered the firstborn of the Egyptians according to this Israelite mythology. Josephus, again, to counter Apion and the others who were keen and aware of the fact that the Israelites were up to all of this, he said, I am now in the next place to say a few things to those who endeavor to prove that our Constitution is but of late time. For this reason, as they pretend that the Greek writers have said nothing about us, after which I shall produce testimony for our antiquity out of the writings of foreigners, I shall also demonstrate that such as cast reproaches upon our nation do it very unjustly. I being Josephus, the Israelite, the apologist for the Israelites against the accusations of the Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans, that they had fabricated their history to claim the throne of the Egyptians and to steal their god Seth and to make that god the ruler of all gods, the destroyer of all other gods, and the ruler of the earth with the Israelites as his chosen people. I shall begin with the writings of the Egyptians, not indeed of those that have written in the Egyptian language, which it is impossible for me to do. But Manetho was a man who was by birth an Egyptian, yet had he made himself master of the Greek learning, as is very evident. For he wrote the history of his own country in the Greek tongue by translating it, as he saith himself, out of their sacred records. He also finds great fault with Herodotus for his ignorance and false relations of Egyptian affairs. Now this Manetho, in the second book of his Egyptian history, writes concerning us in the following manner. Now we have to take all this with a grain of salt, because Josephus was a fabricator, a liar, and misrepresented many things. But it's tremendously significant that he is either accurately recording what Manetho said or putting words in Manetho's mouth, but doing so in such a manner as to represent the Israelites not as the suffering people of Moses, but as the subversive conquerors of the Pharaoh's throne of Joseph. I will set down his very words as if I were to bring the very man himself into a court for a witness. There was a king of ours whose name was Timaus. Under him it came to pass, I know not how, that God was averse to us, and there came, after a surprising manner, men of ignoble birth out of the eastern parts. This is describing the Pharaoh and the Egyptians and how they were overthrown by the Hyksos, and had boldness enough to make an expedition into our country, and with ease subdued it by force, yet without our hazarding a battle with them. This is described in the Old Testament as Joseph's usurpation of the throne by forcing the Egyptians into starvation and then manipulating them so that they traded the food that they produced in exchange for their freedom, making them all slaves of Pharaoh, but usurping the throne of Pharaoh so that they all became slaves of the Israelites, who were the Hyksos, according to the then accepted mythology of the Israelites, who wanted to portray themselves as if the Hyksos. Whether or not the Hyksos eventually became the Israelites or not is an open question. So when they had gotten those that governed us under their power, they afterwards burnt down our cities and demolished the temples of the gods. That becomes very significant. I'm going to explain that in my next video on where the kosher laws and the laws of unclean animals come from. So in anticipation of that video, keep this in mind, that the Hyksos destroyed the temples of the gods, slaughtered the sacred animals of the Egyptians, and forced the priests to then eat those sacred animals. That was then flipped on the Jews under Antiochus Epiphanes IV. But I'll save that for the video on kosher and unclean animals. And used all the inhabitants after a most barbarous manner. Nay, some they slew, and led their children and their wives into slavery. You'll note in Deuteronomy chapter 21, it talks about how conquered peoples are offered the choice between complete extermination or absolute slavery. So those laws were again adopted as the laws of Seth on how to treat the Egyptians who had abandoned Seth. And when foreign peoples took on Seth as their gods, how the Egyptians should be dealt with by the followers of Seth. At length, they made one of themselves king, whose name was Salatus, and he also lived at Memphis, and made both upper and lower regions pay tribute, and left garrisons in places that were the most proper for them. he chiefly aimed to secure the eastern parts, as foreseeing that the Assyrians, who had then the greatest power, would be desirous of that kingdom and invade them. And as he found in the Seth Nomus, Seth Rohite, again, this is being named after Seth, the evil god of chaos and darkness, who became or was the god of foreigners representing the Hyksos and the Israelites. A city very proper for his purpose, and which lay upon the Bubastic channel, but with regard to a certain theologic notion, was called Avaris. Avaris became the seat of the Hyksos, and they secured it with a wall and made it very strong. This he rebuilt and made very strong by the walls he built about it, and by a most numerous garrison of 240,000 armed men, whom he put into it to keep it. Notice that the Israelites are today building walls to secure their Avaris in Palestine. Thither Salatus came in summertime, partly to gather his corn and pay his soldiers their wages, and partly to exercise his armed men, and thereby to terrify foreigners. Gathering his corn, that all relates again to the mythology of Joseph. When this man had reigned 13 years, after him reigned another, whose brother was Beon, for 44 years. After him reigned another, Apachias, 36 years and 7 months. After him, Apophis reigned 61 years. Notice that Apophis relates to the Egyptian serpent of evil and darkness that battles with Ra in the underworld each night in an attempt to keep creation from being born with the sunrise the next day. So this is the worship of evil, of darkness, and chaos by these Sethian Hyksos who worship Seth, the chief god of darkness and chaos. And then Jonias 50 years and 1 month, and after all these reigned Asis 49 years and 2 months. And these 6 were the first rulers among them, who were all along making war with the Egyptians, and were very desirous gradually to destroy them to the very roots, as in exterminating the firstborn, killing off the Egyptians, taking their place, and worshiping their god Seth to restore him on the throne as the chief god of Egypt. I myself am starting to confuse the two. This whole nation was styled Hyksos, that is, shepherd kings. For the first syllable Hyk, according to the sacred dialect, denotes a king, as is Sos, a shepherd. Again, all of this may have been fabricated by Josephus. We don't know, and it's largely irrelevant to my theory, the most important thing being that Josephus is representing this as if it is the history of the Israelites. But this, according to the ordinary dialect, and more importantly than that, as the authors of the Torah and of the oral Torah, as representing this as if the history of the Israelites in their coded written manuscript, the Torah and the Old Testament, and in their esoteric and cryptic oral traditions. And of these is compounded Hyksos, but some say that these people were Arabians. Now in another copy of Manetho, it is said that this word does not denote kings, but on the contrary denotes captive shepherds. So here we introduce the mythology of the Israelites in the written tradition as slaves of the Egyptians, whereas in the oral tradition, they were the kings of the Egyptians. And that is one of the distinctions that was kept secret, so that the Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians wouldn't be aware of the fact that the Israelites viewed themselves as the Hyksos who were going to take over the world and who were the chosen of the evil god Seth. And on this account of the particle hic, for that hic with the aspiration in the Egyptian tongue again denotes shepherds, and that expressly also, and this seems to me the more probable opinion and more agreeable to ancient history. But Manetho goes on, these people whom we have before named kings and called shepherds also, and their descendants, as he said, kept possession of Egypt 511 years. That becomes 430 years in the Torah. After these, he says that the kings of Thebais and of other parts of Egypt made an insurrection against the shepherds, and that there a terrible and long war was made between them. He says farther that under a king whose name was Alisfragmuthosis, the shepherds were subdued by him, and they were indeed driven out of other parts of Egypt, but were shut up in a place that contained 10,000 acres. This place was named Avaris. Avaris was later replaced by Alexandria and the Jewish quarter in Alexandria. Manetho says that the shepherds built a wall round all this place, which was a large and strong wall, and this in order to keep all their possessions and their prey within a place of strength. But that Thumosis, the son of Alisfragmuthosis, made an attempt to take them by force and by siege, with 480,000 men to lie round about them. But that upon his despair of taking the place by that siege, they came to a composition with them that they should leave Egypt and go without harm and be done them, whitherso they would, and that after this composition was made, that they went away with their whole families and effects, not fewer in number than 240,000, and took their journey from Egypt through the wilderness for Syria, but that as they were in fear of the Assyrians, who had then the dominion over Asia, they built a city in that country. Now this is all the mythology of Moses as opposed to the mythology of Joseph. But then in the oral tradition, Moses is instead Ramses II, conquering all of the areas surrounding Canaan for the eventual benefit of Israel. And that this greater, vastly expanded Egyptian empire would then be inherited by Jacob and by the Israelites, who had then the dominion over Asia. They built a city in that country which is now called Judea, and that large enough to contain this great number of men, and called it Jerusalem. This may all have been a fabrication by Josephus, and probably earlier by the authors of the written and oral traditions of Judaism. But that's not as relevant as the fact that they portrayed it in this way. Now Manetho, in another book of his, says that this nation, thus called shepherds, were also called captives in their sacred books. And this account of his is the truth, for feeding of sheep was the employment of our forefathers in the most ancient ages. And as they led such a wandering life in feeding sheep, they were called shepherds. Nor was it without reason that they were called captives by the Egyptians, since one of our ancestors, Joseph, told the king of Egypt that he was a captive, and afterwards sent for his brethren into Egypt by the king's permission. But as for these matters, I shall make a more exact inquiry about them elsewhere. The reality is that they portrayed Joseph as if the Hyksos, and Moses as if Ramses. But that's all cryptically encoded in the oral tradition. But now I shall produce the Egyptians as witnesses to the antiquity of our nation. I shall therefore here bring in Manetho again, and what he writes as to the order of the times in this case, and thus he speaks. When this people, or shepherds, were gone out of Egypt to Jerusalem, Thutmose, the king of Egypt, who drove them out, reigned afterward 25 years and 4 months, and then died. After him his son Shebron took the kingdom for 13 years, after whom came Amenophis for 20 years and 7 months, and then came his sister Ameses for 21 years and 9 months, and after her came Mephris for 12 years and 9 months. After him was Mephramutosis for 25 years and 10 months, and after him was Thutmose for 9 years and 8 months. After him came Amenophis for 30 years and 10 months. After him came Orus for 36 years and 5 months. Then came his daughter Asencris for 12 years and 1 month. Then was her brother Rathosis for 9 months, etc., etc., etc. After him, Amenophis for 19 years and 6 months. After him came Sethosis, as in Seth, and Ramses, who had an army of horse and a naval force, the Leviathan and the Behemoth. This king appointed his brother Armaeus to be his deputy over Egypt. In another copy it stood thus: After him came Sethosis and Ramses, 2 brethren, the former of whom had a naval force, and in a hostile manner destroyed those that met him upon the sea. But as he slew Ramses in no long time afterwards, so he appointed another of his brethren to be deputy over Egypt. Sounds a lot like Jacob and Esau, doesn't it? He also gave him all the other authority of a king, but with these only injunctions, that he should not wear diadem, nor be injurious to the queen, the mother of his children, and that he should not meddle with the other concubines of the king, while he made an expedition against Cyrus and Phoenicia, and besides against the Assyrians and the Medes. Sounds a lot like Potiphar's wife and Joseph. He then subdued them all, some by his arms, some without fighting, and some by the terror of his great army. And being puffed up by the great successes he had had, he went on still the more boldly, and overthrew the cities and countries that lay in the eastern parts. But after some considerable time, Armaeus, who was left in Egypt, did all those very things by way of opposition which his brother had forbidden him to do without fear. For he used violence to the queen, and continued to make use of the rest of the concubines without sparing any of them. Nay, at the persuasion of his friends, he put on the diadem and set up to oppose his brother. But then he who was set over the priests of Egypt wrote letters to Sethosis, and informed him of all that had happened, and how his brother had set up to oppose him. He therefore returned back to Pelusium immediately, and recovered his kingdom again. The country also was called from his name Egypt, for Manetho says that Sethosis himself was called Egyptus, and was his brother Armaeus called Danaus. Notice that this all relates to Seth becoming the chief force of Egypt, and the kingdom of Ramses II, which is to become Greater Israel. So those are some of the basic elements of my theory that the Hebrews, the Israelites as they call themselves, were a fabrication of the Jews of Alexandria who wanted to create the mythology that the Egyptian god Seth had chosen them as his chosen people to replace the Egyptians as the second-born who would replace the firstborn Egyptians, inherit the kingdom of Ramses II, and from it rule the entire world. This is tremendously significant, of course, because this represents the idea that we face a people who worship what the Christians would perceive to be Satan and who want to impose the will of Satan on the entire universe and eliminate all of the non-Israelites who they perceive to be the firstborn of Egypt and take their place. And this mythology is incorporated into the mythology of Esau and Jacob. I need your help to keep this going. Please contribute. And again, I want to thank all of those of you who made this possible and look forward to my next video on kosher and unclean animals and how it relates to all this and how the adoption of that mythology has led to terrible persecutions of the Jewish people, which are an inversion of the persecutions that the Hyksos inflicted upon the Egyptians. How this horror of religion and religious attacks has resulted in this reciprocal cycle that needs to be broken, where the Seth worshippers destroy the temples and force the priests to eat the flesh of their sacred animals, which is then reversed on the Hyksos to destroy their temples and force them to eat the flesh of their sacred animals. And amazingly, what those sacred animals are to the Israelites and how they came about. Please like, share, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that. It's a very important video. Please contribute. I do need your help. And I want to thank those who have contributed from the bottom of my heart. Your generous gifts have helped me to survive and to make these videos and conduct this ongoing important research. I will see all you good people next time. Thank you for watching.